Welcome to one of Ilkley Manor House's 2020 Heritage Open Days events. We're delighted to welcome Professor Mike Dixon, who's going to take us on a guided tour around the outside of this wonderful building in the centre of Ilkley.
Is that I've been secretary of the Friends of the Manor House for about 20 years, and I'm very interested in this building, and I want to share some of my enthusiasm for it with you today. So I'd like you to just look behind me, beyond me, at the overall structure, and it can be divided into three parts. A central part, which was the original medieval hall, and then to my left the servants' wing, and to my right the area of the building occupied originally by the Lord of the Manor. And that's generally referred to as the solar wing, right? It's not called solar because it's got more light in it than the rest of the building. It's called solar because it comes from an old French word meaning a room on beams. So the masters, the Lord of the Manor's part, was always a sort of two-storey structure, in contrast to this central part, the original medieval hall, which was a single chamber going up to the roof. Now, it's also, well, I was going to say easy. It isn't easy, but with architectural knowledge, which I've read rather than I've been taught, you can look at various phases of the building, and we'll start by looking around the doorway. The building is possibly unique in being a late medieval hall, which was the central part of which was built of masonry. Now there's plenty of masonry around here because it was the original Roman fort. And the architectural historians think that that area of the building is 14th century. So that represents the oldest part that which we can see. And so the archway and the surrounding masonry, which is much larger, coarser than the other parts of the masonry, indicate that that's 14th century. That's supported by something you can see on the inside in the cross passage, which goes from the front door to the back. And on the left of that, the entrances to what were the kitchen and the buttery have characteristic lintels over them. And they're called Carnarvon lintels, and they're also a feature from the 14th century. So it's possible that there was an earlier wooden structure, because obviously these manors, including the Manor of Ilkley, were created after the Norman conquest. So there's quite a bit of time between the establishment of the manors from the old French manoir to what we know as the original masonry structure. So there may have been a wooden building. But we'll move on from that and look at the Lord of the Manor's wing, and indeed all this part, apart from those few remnants around the doorway, this part was dated to the late 16th century. Notice that the windows have got they're mullioned windows with vertical stone strips between the glazing, and they've got round heads. Notice that. So those round-headed windows are carried through for the rest of this structure and dated at 16th century. Just have a look at this wing. You'll notice that the windows now have become square-headed mullioned windows, and they've also got a ledge above them. You perhaps can appreciate that. Each has got a ledge, which was a 17th century feature and took the rain away from the window proper. Furthermore, this has got 3 stories, and that's in great contrast to the rest of the building. And the levels inside are all over the place. The joining of these 2 wings ended up as something rather haphazard. That's largely because they put a floor into this central great single chamber when they did this extension here in the 16th century, and that necessitated there being a stairwell up to the first floor. and there was also a minstrel's gallery prior to that, which had access from the servants' area, and that accounts for some of the disparity of levels inside. If you were to go inside, you would see that this is a bay out of the central chamber. So that was an addition. The whole of this part of the building was expanded southwards, and this gave increased light into the main chamber, and it's called an oriel bay, O-R-I-E-L, oriel bay. So that part is still within the big chamber of the building. So moving from just about the level of this drain pipe here to the end of the building was the Lord of the Manor's quarters, and it was closed off from the main chamber by a wooden screen bringing the full height of the chamber, and that was replaced in the 18th century by a stone wall. So the Lord of the Manor had sort of visual privacy by virtue of this wooden screen, but he didn't have much auditory privacy. And so we move on, and this, as I say, was a two-floored part of the building with what was originally the solar room above, and this lower part, the ground floor, would be the parlour, from the old French parler. It was a room in which you met people and spoke to them. So we now move around to the east end of the building. Now, a very sort of fine point here is when you look at the masonry at this corner, you'll notice that it is somewhat paler, as there's a strip of pale stones compared to the rest of it. That's because in the 18th century they built another cottage onto the end of the manor house. The place was divided into 5 cottages, 4 in the main part of the building, and this additional cottage on the end here between the end wall of the manor house and the church wall. And you can see remnants of mortar and distemper of the original small cottage. Indeed, if we come round to this east end of the building, you'll be able to see now, for instance, these 2 holes, mortises, that supported the joists for the first floor of this small cottage on the end here. 2-storey cottage, but really very small in terms of its footprint. Now this part of the manor house, from there to the end, is a structure that includes the flues for the 2 fires, the 2 rather large fireplaces in the parlour and an even bigger one in the upper room. And much of this is the fireplace chimney. But here is another, to me, interesting feature, because that is the exit for the chute that came down from the garde-robe in the upper chamber. The garde-robe was a euphemism for the latrine. And so the effluent, excrement, came out here. Presumably some poor peasant had the job of picking up the collecting tray or bin here and disposing of it, but we don't know anything about that. And there you can see various tar remnants of some roofing that was on an outbuilding here. So the whole building was tidied up in the 1950s. This cottage was demolished, and the interior was rearranged as much as possible to show the state of affairs at the end of the 17th century. So we'll move to the end of the building. Now this north wall is very different in several respects to how it was in the manor house's original state. So we know that this was expanded northwards in the 16th century. That is an original window. The others are not originals, and this is not an original doorway either. This is a health and safety doorway, and we're now moving along from the Lord of the Manor's wing, and then past this drain pipe. This was the stairwell that had to be built to allow people to go up to the upper floor, but it didn't allow people to go into the Lord of the Manor's private wing. No. He had a separate entrance, and the stairs originally went back on themselves onto a landing, and the landing gave access into what is now the upper gallery. So it wasn't configured any way like it is at present, but that's what happened to it. So we now come to the end of this 16th century part, the solar wing and the stairwell. And we move to an area here, which, if you can look just over here, is butted on. This was 17th century, all this part, in keeping with the rebuilding and expansion of the servants' wing. And this rear door is an interesting feature in itself, because if you can look into this alcove, you will see that it is set inside. It's back from the existing rear wall. And that represents the end of what was the original cross passage, and tells us the original dimensions of the rectangular space that was the medieval hall. So this part, as I say, rebuilt in the 17th century, came over the original rear door. It's still the rear door, but the original part of it, to form a little room for servants' quarters, and, if you like, a porch over the door. So this was reconfigured, probably elevated to some extent, in the 17th century. Noticing on our right some remnants of the Roman wall, and it's interesting that the west wall of the manor house, the west wall, which we're coming to now, is on the line of the Roman fort, and it obviously was very, very convenient to use masonry from the fort in its building. So some of these stones are Roman. So we're now looking at the west wall of what was the servants' quarters, and this part we assume was the kitchen, and that part there was the buttery where wine and beer, particularly beer, was stored, because beer was the universal drink. You didn't trust the water. And then down here is are the remnants of a plinth. The plinths were always put in place to support a wooden structure. If you put a wooden structure straight on the ground, it will rot. So that's some evidence that this wing at least was of timber construction. This object here, this stone, has got, if you can move round, you can see that it's got a gully carved in it, and that was to take waste, we assume, from the kitchen. So the kitchen sink led into that gully, and it ran to waste out here. Just look upwards. I don't know how well you'll see that, but the upper window is remarkably close to the roof line, so close that it doesn't look like a designed feature, and that, I think, reflects the rather cramped way in which they had to put in the third floor in this wing. And we come back to square one. So that was a quick circuit covering about 3 centuries, and I hope you've formed a clear impression of just how complex and almost unique the rebuilding of this masonry structure took place over the years. Thanks for listening and looking.
We hope you enjoyed Mike's informative tour of the house from the outside, And if you want some more information, we do have 2 new interpretation boards in the courtyard which were funded by Museum Development Yorkshire. And we also have more information on our website. And we look forward to welcoming you to the Manor House in the very near future.